let's go to the big story of the day, if not the week, maybe even perhaps the year, the way it's going, which is, of course, whether the Tory immigration policy is a bit Nazi. Now, no, wait, sorry, that's not the story. The story is whether Gary Lineker is allowed to say that. Now, for those of you who've been living under a rock, we'll try and go through this as quickly as we can. The government announced a new policy for the migrants and asylum seekers that are arriving by boat, which was that they were going to be banned from claiming asylum, right? That was the policy. This new law was one that even the government said wouldn't stand the test because it was illegal. And this newspaper said that it was just a way of setting up human rights judges as sort of the bogeyman for blaming when the boats keep coming. Now, anywho, the main presenter of Match of the Day, Gary Lineker, who's widely regarded as the nicest man in football, quite beloved by a lot of people who aren't Tory MPs, he said on Twitter that that rhetoric was reminiscent of 1930s Germany. Then the government, which remember definitely doesn't want to distract anybody from the actual policy, made a huge hoo-ha about it. The deputy chairman, the backbenchers, even ministers were weighing in to say they were offended, that Lineker should shut up and go away, etc. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, was saying, "My husband's Jewish, how dare you?" The BBC asked Lineker to apologise. He said nope. They suspended him from doing Match of the Day, and then what seems like the entirety of the BBC sports department just downed tools and walked out in solidarity. Now, Ben, this is a whole new nationwide strike, it would appear, but it's being reported today in the Mirror that the BBC is caving an awful lot quicker than the government. What's this deal that they're supposed to be discussing to get him back on the airwaves?
Oh, well, we can sit there waiting for white smoke over the next 24 hours. Our time. So the deal looks like it will be some sort of fudge where Lineker comes back on it. And I have to say, right, I know this is not necessarily the prevailing opinion. I can't stand him. I think he's an overpaid, not very good presenter, right? And I much preferred Match of the Day on Saturday night, where we didn't have to listen to Lineker and Shearer and Wrighty analysing and joshing with each other. It was much better just having the football. I much preferred that. And I managed to make it to the end, because often on Saturday night I fall asleep in the middle of it. I'm all for that. But as I say, that's not the prevailing attitude. The deal will be a review of how BBC stars are allowed to use social media, what they're allowed to tweet about. So Lineker will come back on air. This review will take place. You have to presume that during that time, even Lineker might agree to be on his best behaviour and not start accusing the government of Nazi policies. Meanwhile, government, or the BBC rather, will come up with some sort of fudge that says, you can tweet, but please don't go too far, or something like that. Because I think the BBC has made a complete horlicks of how they've dealt with it. And the backlash that sort of greeted this, because a lot of people are on Lineker's side. They think as a freelancer, he should be allowed to say what he wants when he's not on a BBC platform. Now, the counter argument to that, of course, is a lot of his profile, particularly his profile today, not thinking back to when he was a goal-hanging striker stealing goals for England in the late 80s and early 90s.
Steady. Getting into a whole different area of controversy now, Ben.
His profile now comes from him being on BBC, which, of course, is funded by the licence fee, which we all have to have if we want to watch TV, even if you don't watch the BBC. So the argument is that because his profile comes from the BBC, what he says to his 8.5 million followers on Twitter is still related to his position at the BBC. And it's quite interesting. Mark Damazer, who's one of the former DGs, former Director Generals of the BBC, he was on the television yesterday, on the BBC, obviously, but he's actually written in the Times today saying that the guidelines as they were updated in autumn 2020, ironically, to counter Gary Lineker tweeting, that Lineker is in breach of those guidelines. And when you read them, he is quite clearly. So then it becomes less. I mean, there are several facets to this row, aren't there? Whether or not you agree with the Tory policy of saying people who come by boats aren't allowed to claim asylum. Well, that's number one. Number two is whether Lineker should be allowed to tweet about it. Number three is what he actually tweeted, which even, senior Labour MPs, not just privately, but publicly, they say he went far too far in what he said. He really doesn't understand the issue. And then, of course, there's the BBC gone under pressure from Conservative MPs? Have they just done, were they in the right to do it anyway? I mean, to a certain extent, it's insubordination by Lineker, isn't it? He's challenging his boss. He's told, you're not allowed to do this. It's written down in black and white. And he goes and does it anyway, because he, or his supporters might, or certainly his critics would say he thinks he's bigger than the BBC. Well, in this Mexican standoff we've had over the weekend, where mercifully we didn't have to listen to all these supposed great analysis on Match of the Day on Saturday night, well, that's what it's come down to. And I think perhaps Lineker was surprised himself that he got suspended. And now finding this negotiated settlement that appears to be coming out of a new broadcasting house, that will suit everyone, at least temporarily.
Yeah. Now, it sounds like the deal, I thought about this, sounds like Ben's not a big fan of Match of the Day. I think that's clear to everybody. I don't think I'm saying anything too controversial there. Now, Mike says yesterday that BBC presenter Michael Portillo was on GB News giving his political opinions. I assume the BBC will be suspending him until he apologises. Maybe, Mike, but I suppose the argument there would be that Portillo's fame comes from his politics, not the fact he works for the BBC now. Wayne says, we need strict immigration laws. It was only women and children. People would feel differently, but it's mainly men that are coming. How can he say it's like what Hitler done? Hitler killed millions, FFS. He didn't say it was like killing. That was the whole point. I think part of the problem was that when he started talking about 1930s Germany, people think you're talking about the Holocaust and the murder and all the rest of these things, which of course is part of all that. And the Holocaust started in 1933. But he didn't actually talk about the mass murder. What he was talking about was the rhetoric of the Conservative Party and the rhetoric of Nazi Germany. And that isn't about saying someone's going to kill somebody else. It's about the way you talk about other people. And a year ago, Holocaust survivors wrote to Suella Braverman saying exactly the same thing. So, and they didn't get criticised quite like this. Alan says, I see Lineker as the Walker's Crisps guy, not a BBC man. I suppose Lineker would say his position at the BBC comes from the fact he was a footballer, not anything else. Lisa said, what happened to freedom of speech? He obviously felt very strongly about it. And there's this point as well, isn't there, Ben? Because whether you agree with what Lineker said or not, whether you like the votes policy or you don't, if you are a conservative backbencher, you should be really big on not cancelling people, giving everyone freedom of speech, the right to say whatever the hell they like, even if other people are offended. I thought that's what that particular Venn diagram, I thought Suella Braverman, Lee Anderson, all these people were bang on for freedom of speech. But it would appear freedom of speech for everybody, except if they're on the BBC and running Match of the Day.
Well, one thinks of that often misattributed to Voltaire. I'll disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. The Home Office today, you could interpret this as top trolling, really, by the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. The Home Office has announced today a reform for police about how they deal with non-crime hate speech offences.
I saw that, yes.
Protecting freedom of speech, stopping cancel culture. And all this after we've had the last 6 days dominated by a row about whether an overpaid presenter, former England footballer, is allowed to tweet something. It is deeply ironic that has taken place today. Perhaps not an accident, but that was when the Home Office, the Home Secretary, has chosen to announce it. But yeah, you're right that those Conservative backbenchers who kick off left, right and centre about people being cancelled and no platform, controversial speakers at universities. And, freedom of speech is fundamental to British values. It is what we are. And then to attack Gary Lineker for doing it, using his freedom of speech, there is a big argument about whether or not the Conservative MPs who champion freedom of speech and rail against no platform, and whether or not they should then be attacking someone just because he says something that they disagree with.
Exactly. Now, Only Me, who isn't actually me, that's the name they're going under on Faceache, says, Gary said what he said on his own time, not the BBC's time. The BBC can't own you off air. You're right, Only Me. And as a freelancer myself, I'm kind of on that side of things. But I would add, if, for example, the BBC employed me to go on to their pay-per-view programme, as they did before it was cancelled by the cancel culture at the BBC these days, and I said something which is, I'm paid to go on there to express my opinion, as it were. But if I said something which was really anti Ofcom rules or defamation law or kind of anti some of my purpose or was really anti-BBC in some way, I would expect probably not to get invited back on again as a freelancer. But of course, Gary Lineker's got a contract. He's got a deal that he goes on air no matter what. And so he feels obviously fairly secure in that. And I suspect is that as well, Ben, although he's paid about 1.3 million, which is one of the highest paid BBC stars, there was talk over the weekend that he could be going to ITV or Sky for 3 times that if the BBC upset him too much. So I suppose he feels pretty secure that the BBC need him as well as the other way around.
Yeah, you know, for some reason, he is well thought of as a sports presenter.
Put it aside, Ben. Put it aside.
This will be in demand. I mean, interesting, BT Sport, where he used to present their Champions League coverage up until I think 2021. They've said they don't want him back, presumably because he costs too much money. You'd think, yeah, if he went, I mean, that might be a solution that suits everyone, because often the BBC's excuse for paying these outrageous salaries is, well, they can earn even more in the commercial sector. At which point, some of us think, well, why didn't you go and earn that in the commercial sector then? And indeed, you've seen that with some of the really big name presenters who have left the BBC in recent months and over the past year or so. Emily Maitlis, John Sokol, Andrew Marr have all gone off to Global. So if there are bigger salaries out there and they want to jump ship, and they've got license then to, you know, not be bound to the same extent by BBC impartiality rules, well, then maybe that suits everyone. But I don't think that will happen in the Lineker case. I do think there will be a deal that keeps him presenting Match of the Day and the handful of other shows that he does during the course of a year. And allows him to tweet, but probably not to the same extent that he has been.
Yeah, well, we'll see, won't we? It sounds like the Fudge is going to be offering a review of the guidelines for BBC staff, or stars, I should say, and also a review of how the BBC handled this, because they have handled it really badly. And that will find some way to get Lineker back on air. Now, Mike says if Lineker had tweeted, you know what, the government are right, we should stop the boats, there would have been no fuss from the BBC or government over him expressing a political opinion. I think he's probably got a point there. So Lineker does have the angels on his side a little bit, it would seem, because he is by no means the first BBC star to stray into politics. Great British Bake Off winner, and remember, she's just a member of the public who was a contestant, Nadia Hussain, criticised on Twitter the airstrikes in Syria. Alan Sugar, the star of The Apprentice, published and then deleted a picture of Jeremy Corbyn sitting next to Adolf Hitler. Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, who has a weekly programme on Radio 5 Live, he actively campaigns to change government policy. He has been about this budget that's coming up in the next few weeks. And we've also had, most of us know, the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, helped the previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, secure an 800 grand loan when he was still in office, and Sharp was up for the job at the BBC. It is not unknown for people who are on the BBC, but their own person, who are not journalists, to tweet their personal opinions about politics. And it doesn't get them in trouble, does it, Ben? I mean, although you may not like Lineker, and this, as you know, like you said, some of the MPs have said he has just gone too far by talking about the Nazis. You know, if Nadia Hussain can criticise airstrikes in Syria, and Alan Sugar can post a picture of Jeremy Corbyn actually sat next to Adolf Hitler, although he did delete it, then, you know, they've got to let Gary Lineker do this, haven't they?
Like I say, I think there will be some fudge where he's allowed to carry on tweeting, but maybe not to the same extent. I think when Mike mentioned...
Just don't say Nazi.
Well, I don't think he ever actually said Nazi in that tweet.
No, don't refer to Deutschland unless it's about the 1966 World Cup. It's the only time you're allowed to say it.
I think when Mike said that if he'd have said we've got to stop the boats, keep the migrants out or whatever, that would be fine. Well, I think Mike's right to a certain extent that the government wouldn't have had a problem with that. I think the BBC would have had a massive problem with that. I do think the BBC just doesn't want their stars getting involved in this sort of thing, particularly when Tim Davie, the Director General, has made his premiership of the BBC all about restoring impartiality. I think if Gary Lineker had have endorsed the government's policy, that would create a huge backlash. And in the same way that the Conservative MPs have had a pop at him for criticising the policy, I think Labour MPs would have, I mean, aside from the actual bombshell shock factor, Gary Lineker endorsing what the government had done, there would then be well, this is outrageous, you know, shouldn't be allowed to do this, what about impartiality? It really is, as you know, that divide is as strong. So I do think there would have been a backlash, both at the BBC and from non-Conservative MPs had he have endorsed the government's policy.
And of course, there have been quite a backlash on Twitter, which is a slightly different demographic to Britain as a whole, because not everybody in Britain is on it, and slightly different opinions about things like migration policies sometimes, although Elon Musk is doing his best to change that. But it's got to be said, if they have this review, perhaps sport fans, some of them will be happy. And some of them won't be, but it's got to be said, Ben, although you were happier with Match of the Day without Gary Lineker on it, it only lasted 20 minutes. Maybe that's why you didn't fall asleep in front of it. The normal one is an hour and a half nearly. And there's a lot more content, and it gets people, gripped into the channel for a lot longer. If they've got to do 20 minutes every weekend because there's no Lineker and no one else doing it and no commentary, they would be in a very, very sticky wicket. I mean,
the viewing figures this morning.
What were they?
So normally Match of the Day gets 2 million. On Saturday night, it was 2.5 million. So that's 20% more people watched the abridged Match of the Day than watched the hour and 20-minute version.
Yeah, but they watched it to see how bad it was. We all turn things on when we think they're going to be awful sometimes, don't we? They don't turn it on because they think it'd be better necessarily. We're not clear on that yet. It was whether or not you would get 2.5 million every week if that was what you did. And we should have to wait and see. But Tim Davie, the Director General, is supposed to be coming back to Britain. He's been in the States the last few days while this has been blowing up, and is supposed to be sorting some of this out and having talks. But we'll have to see, won't we? Now, get into the comments. What do you think about all of this? Do you think Lineker was right? Do you think he has a wrong, but he has a perfect right to say it? Do you think he should never have said it and has no right to say it, and the government is absolutely right? Let us know. I would suggest that any person here, anyone watching this, you have a perfect right to go onto Twitter or Facebook and say whatever the hell you like. You are bound by some laws. You are publishers. You have to watch out for defamation and contempt of court and things like that. But if you wanted to say immigration policy was Nazi, then you could if you wanted to. But Gary Lineker can't, even though he's not a politician, he's not a journalist. He should, in theory, be able to do some of these things. Although, as we're hearing, not everyone thinks it was a little bit, past the knuckle, put it that way.